They hadn't seen each other in years. She walked out of his life with nothing but a suitcase, swearing he'd never see her again. He thought she was gone for good until one night, at a glamorous celebration, he froze in his tracks. Because there she was, not in the way he remembered, not at his side, but standing in front of him, her voice filling the room, and a truth he had ignored finally hitting him in the chest like a freight train. Mark Sterling lived like a man untouchable. At 42 years old, he was worth over $300 million. His empire stretched across countries, from luxury hotels to private resorts that only the powerful could afford. He wore $10,000 suits, drove cars most people only dreamed about, and commanded boardrooms with the kind of presence that left no room for argument. Every step he took was sharp, precise, and dripping with confidence. But power and money had hardened him. Years earlier, when his wife Sarah begged him to think about building a family together, he looked her dead in the eye and told her that children would only be a distraction. Business came first. Always. And when she cried, asking him if she wasn't enough for him, his answer was cold, final, and cruel. If you can't accept that, maybe you're not the right woman for me. The divorce papers were ready that same week. Sarah had screamed at him through tears, swearing he would never see her again. Mark smirked, thinking it was perfect. One less complication in his life. To him, love had been nothing more than a liability. 3 years passed. In that time, he multiplied his fortune. He collected supermodels on his arm like trophies. He built the monopoly he had always wanted in the tourism industry. In his mind, Sarah was nothing more than a lesson. Don't mix feelings with business. But life has a way of teaching lessons you don't expect. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. Mark had just closed the biggest deal of his career, and he booked the most exclusive restaurant in the city. He arrived in his black Aston Martin, adjusting his platinum Rolex as the valet practically bowed to him. He felt on top of the world, waiting for the model he was dating to arrive. Everything about the night was polished perfection. Until the waiter came to his table with a bottle of wine. Mark looked up, expecting just another nameless server, but the sight stopped him cold. The gold phone in his hand slipped and crashed to the marble floor. Standing in front of him was Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman he had thrown away like nothing. She wore the crisp black and white uniform of the restaurant, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, but Mark's eyes went straight to her belly. She was pregnant, very pregnant. Her face looked older, worn by sleepless nights and exhaustion. Yet her green eyes, the same ones that once looked at him with love, Mark stared with something between panic, humiliation, and raw strength. "Would you like me to open the bottle, sir?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay professional. Mark couldn't breathe. The memories came flooding back. Their wedding day, Sunday mornings in their penthouse, her tears the night she asked for a family, and he refused. And now she was standing in front of him, carrying a child, working herself to the bone in a place where one dinner cost more than she probably earned in a month. When his date finally arrived, Sarah excused herself with dignity and walked away. But Mark couldn't focus on anything else. He watched the kitchen doors, hoping she would reappear. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts, mergers, or yachts. He was thinking about Sarah, the woman he had abandoned, the woman now carrying someone else's child. Mark couldn't stay at the table. His date's laughter and chatter blurred into meaningless noise. He stood up suddenly, pretending to make a phone call, and pushed through the restaurant until he found the kitchen doors. Through the glass window, he saw her, sitting in a chair, one hand resting on her aching back, the other holding a glass of water. She looked exhausted, as if even standing was a battle. For a moment she closed her eyes, trying to gather strength. That image pierced Mark's heart. The woman who once lived in luxury now looked like she was fighting to survive. He couldn't hold back. He pushed through the doors, ignoring the protests of the chefs and staff. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with something he hadn't felt in years. She looked up, her face full of horror that he had followed her. "Mark, you can't be here," she whispered. "Please, leave. I need this job." But he couldn't. She dragged him out the back door into the cold alley, away from curious eyes. She leaned against the wall, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. "What do you want, Mark? Did you come to laugh? To confirm you were right about me?" "I didn't know you were working here," he stammered. "I didn't know you were pregnant." Her bitter laugh cut the night air. "Of course you didn't." "Why would you? 3 years ago, you told me you wanted nothing to do with my life ever again." The truth hit him harder than any deal gone wrong. He remembered the way he had thrown her out, offering her $50,000 as if that could replace 5 years of marriage. For him, it had been pocket change. For her, it was supposed to rebuild an entire life. "Sarah, I thought." "You thought what? That I could survive forever on your scraps? That after dedicating my life to being your perfect wife, I could just snap my fingers and start over? I begged you to see me, to hear me, and you chose money over me." Her voice broke, and for the first time, Mark had no answer. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. From his $20 million penthouse, he stared out at the glittering city, but all he could see was Sarah, hunched in exhaustion in the alley. Somewhere among those lights, she was alone, pregnant, and struggling. He had lived 3 years telling himself he was right, that she would move on, maybe even be better without him, but the image of her uniform, her trembling hands, and that swollen belly destroyed all his justifications. By morning, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He called his assistant, Carmen, a woman who had worked for him loyally for years. "I need you to investigate someone," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Sarah Miller. She was Sarah Sterling until 3 years ago. Carmen, discreet and efficient, returned that afternoon with the truth. Sarah lived in a tiny apartment, paid $800 a month in rent. She worked 5 nights a week at the restaurant for $12 an hour, plus tips. On weekends, she cleaned houses. And the baby's father? David Hayes. A man who had promised her love after the divorce, who had proposed when she got pregnant, only for Sarah to find out he was married with children of his own. When she refused hush money, he abandoned her. Mark felt the world tilt. Sarah had not just been betrayed once. She had been betrayed twice. First by him, and then by another man who left her pregnant and alone. But the detail that broke him most was this. On her hospital records, Sarah had listed his name as her emergency contact. Despite everything, when she was asked who to call if her life was in danger, she wrote down his number. Mark Sterling, the man who never canceled a meeting, who had built an empire on discipline and control, suddenly walked away from his Tokyo contract negotiations. His assistant Carmen watched him with new eyes. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, restless, human. "What are you going to do, sir?" she asked. Mark's answer was simple. "I'm going to win my family back. Not the family I had. The family I should have built if I hadn't been such a fool." For the first time, his smile wasn't cold or calculated. It was raw, almost fragile. "That baby may not be mine by blood, but if Sarah lets me, I'll raise him as my own." And so, the war for redemption began. The very next evening, Mark returned to the restaurant. But this time, he left his luxury car at home. He didn't wear his flashiest suit. He arrived quietly, almost humbly, slipping through the doors like an ordinary man. For 10 minutes he stood outside, watching through the glass, scanning the room until he found her. Sarah was working again, balancing trays, hiding her fatigue behind a professional smile. Her belly looked even heavier from the side, and every so often she pressed a hand against her back for support. When he finally sat down at a table in her section, Sarah froze the moment she saw him. Her face paled, her hands shook, but she forced herself to walk over. "Good evening," she said, her voice firm, though her eyes betrayed her panic. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Sarah," Mark whispered, leaning forward. "We need to talk." Her eyes darted nervously to her co-workers. "If you want something, order it. Otherwise, please don't make this harder for me." "I know about David," he said softly. The words dropped like a bomb. Her notepad slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. She bent quickly to pick it up, but her face was pale, her lips trembling. "You can't talk about that here." "Please, Mark." "Then come with me," he urged. "I can't leave my shift. I need this job." Mark's voice cracked as he said, "To keep paying rent on that tiny apartment? To buy groceries that barely cover your needs? Sarah, this isn't living." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Who gave you the right to investigate me? To judge how I survive?" "The right," Mark blurted, his voice louder than he intended, "is given to me by the fact that I love you." The entire room seemed to stop. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations died. Even the restaurant manager turned his head. Sarah stood there, staring at him, tears forming in her eyes. Mark had spent 3 years lying to himself, but the truth had finally escaped. He loved her. He always had. The manager hurried over. "Miss Miller, is there a problem?" Sarah shook her head desperately. "No, sir. Everything is fine." But Mark turned to him, unflinching. "She's 7.5 months pregnant. She's been told by doctors to reduce her hours, yet you've got her working until she's ready to collapse. And she's working 2 jobs because what you pay her isn't enough to survive." The manager blinked, caught between embarrassment and fear. Then Mark dropped the bomb. "Sarah is my ex-wife." A ripple went through the restaurant. Customers whispered. Employees glanced between them, and Sarah's cheeks burned red. She wanted to disappear. "Mark, please stop," she begged, tears spilling now. "Don't humiliate me." But Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I was the one who humiliated you. I was the coward who threw you away. I won't make that mistake again." Her sobs broke then. "I can't trust you, Mark. I can't go through this again. I can't be abandoned a 3rd time." "You won't be," he promised, his own voice shaking. "I can't undo the past, but I can fight for you now. Let me try." The manager finally interrupted again, softer this time. "Sarah, do you want the rest of the night off?" Sarah hesitated. Her heart pounded. Finally, she whispered, "Give me 5 minutes to change." Mark exhaled, almost collapsing with relief. They didn't go to a 5-star restaurant. Mark didn't take her to a penthouse suite. Instead, he led her to a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind of place they used to visit before his millions consumed him. Sarah sat across from him, her uniform replaced by a simple dress, her makeup wiped away. She looked tired, fragile, but still radiantly strong. "This isn't a dinner," she said firmly. "It's a conversation." Mark nodded. "That's all I'm asking." For the first time in 3 years, they talked. Not about contracts or business deals. Not about money. About real things. her struggles after the divorce, the jobs she lost when her pregnancy began to show, the betrayal by David, the nights she cried herself to sleep in her small apartment. Mark listened, really listened, and then he spoke his truth. "Sarah, for 3 years, I've been the richest and most miserable man alive. I thought success would fill the hole. It didn't. I saw you last night, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. Please, let me try to be the man I should have been." Sarah shook her head slowly. "You loved the idea of me, Mark. The wife who looked good on your arm, who fit your image. But you never loved me." "I did," he whispered. "I just didn't know how to show it. I was too proud, too stubborn, too afraid of being human. But Sarah, I can learn. If you let me, I'll love you and that baby with everything I have." Her eyes softened, just slightly. But then she said the words that haunted him. "Words aren't enough, Mark. Not anymore." Weeks passed. Mark tried everything to support Sarah: quietly anonymous rent payments, a private doctor appointment arranged without her knowing. But Sarah resisted. She didn't want pity. She didn't want a savior. She wanted dignity. And then, one night, Mark heard something that stopped him cold. Sarah had taken a second job, not just waiting tables, but singing at a small bar in the evenings for extra money. Mark couldn't believe it. He remembered her voice from their early days, how she would hum while cooking or sing softly in the car. But now, she was performing just to survive. When he walked into that dimly lit bar, the sight made his chest ache. On the small stage, dressed simply, her swollen belly obvious beneath the lights, Sarah sang. Her voice was tender but strong, filled with pain and beauty. The crowd was small, but they applauded warmly. Mark stood frozen at the entrance, unable to move. Memories crashed over him: the nights she used to sing in their penthouse kitchen, barefoot and happy, before his greed poisoned everything. When she finished her song, their eyes met across the room. Sarah's face went pale. She gripped the microphone tighter. Mark finally understood. This wasn't just about money. This was about survival, about strength, about her proving to herself that she could stand, even after everything. And in that moment, Mark knew exactly what he had to do. As the audience clapped, Mark stepped forward. Every eye in the bar turned to him. Sarah's voice trembled. "Mark, please don't." But he did. He walked to the stage, his heart pounding, and asked for the microphone. "3 years ago," he began, his voice unsteady, "I made the worst mistake of my life. I had everything: success, status, and I threw away the only person who truly loved me." He turned to Sarah, his voice breaking. "I threw away you." The bar was silent. Even the bartender froze. I told myself I was too busy for family, too focused for love. But the truth is, I was a coward. I thought money could replace love, and I was wrong. Sarah, I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm here, in front of everyone, to say that I love you. I love the child you're carrying. And if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." Sarah stood frozen, tears running down her cheeks. The audience watched, breathless. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sarah finally whispered into the microphone, her voice trembling but clear. "Mark, I don't know if I can trust you again, but tonight, for the first time, I believe you mean it." The bar erupted in applause, and for the first time in years, Sarah let him take her hand. The applause in the bar slowly faded, but the sound of it lingered in Mark's mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't clinking glasses with investors or listening to empty congratulations. These claps weren't for his business deals. They were for something real, his honesty, his vulnerability, his love. But when the night ended and Sarah walked home, she didn't let him come inside. She stopped at the doorway of her small apartment and looked at him firmly. "Mark, you can't just step back into my life and expect everything to fall into place. You broke me once. I won't let you do it again." Her words cut deep, but he nodded. "Then let me prove I've changed. No promises, no timelines. Just let me be here. For you. For the baby." For the next weeks, he did exactly that. He showed up to drive her to doctor's appointments, quietly sitting in waiting rooms. He picked up groceries when her swollen feet made walking painful. He didn't flash his wealth or try to impress her with gifts. He simply showed up, day after day. And slowly, Sarah began to believe this wasn't the same Mark she had once loved and lost. This was a man trying, for the first time in his life, to put someone else ahead of himself. When the day finally came, it was chaos. Sarah went into labor early, and the clinic rushed to contact her emergency contact. The name they dialed was Mark Sterling. He arrived breathless, not in a suit, not polished or perfect. Just a man terrified of losing the only woman he'd ever truly loved. He held her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, tears running down his face as he begged her to hang on. Hours later, Sarah gave birth to a baby boy. The moment that tiny cry filled the room, Mark felt something he had never experienced in all his years of wealth and power. Not triumph, not conquest, but love. Pure, unconditional love. He kissed Sarah's forehead as she cradled the baby. "He is beautiful," he whispered, "and I don't care who fathered him. I'll raise him as my son if you'll let me." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wet but strong. "You're saying all the right words, Mark. But this isn't about words anymore. It's about what you'll do tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that." Mark nodded. "Then tomorrow, and the day after. I'll be here." It wasn't easy. Sarah didn't just open her heart overnight. Years of pain don't vanish because of a single declaration in a bar. She tested him, kept her guard high, and reminded him often that trust had to be earned. Mark took it all: the silences, the skepticism, the slow steps. He didn't argue or push. He simply kept showing up. He even began to change his business. For years, his empire had been his only priority, but now he cut back his hours, trusting his managers with more responsibility. For the first time, he started saying no to meetings. He sold the penthouse, downsized, and moved closer to Sarah's neighborhood, wanting to be nearby instead of across the city skyline. Carmen, his loyal assistant, noticed the transformation. "Sir, in 5 years I've never seen you happier," she said one morning. "You used to measure success in millions. Now, you measure it in moments." And she was right. For Mark, success was no longer the applause of boardrooms, but the tiny hand of a baby clutching his finger. But redemption always comes with tests. Weeks after the baby's birth, Mark was invited to a high-profile gala, the kind of event he once dominated, where investors expected to see him with a glamorous woman on his arm. Instead, he brought Sarah, still recovering, dressed simply, carrying their newborn in a sling. When they entered the room, whispers started. The powerful people who once admired him looked confused, even judgmental. Some glanced at Sarah's modest dress, at the baby, at the woman who clearly didn't fit the image of a billionaire's companion. Mark felt their eyes on him. Old instincts screamed at him to hide, to protect his image. But this time, he didn't care. He slipped an arm around Sarah, kissed her forehead in front of everyone, and introduced her proudly. "This is Sarah, my wife, and this is our son." The room fell silent. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Some would walk away from deals after that night, unable to reconcile his new priorities with their old expectations. But Mark didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't living for them. He was living for himself and for the family he almost lost forever.